Hello, fellow students, and welcome to the Multiversity. Today, we're going to be looking into the worlds of two comedy greats, Andy Kaufman and Jim Carrey, and asking what their unconventional examples can teach us about the nature of the self, of reality, of meaning, and of how we interact with all of that. We're going to be exploring ideas of identity, of social rules and norms, and also what happens when you break down absolutely all of those things. So let's dive in. Andy Kaufman was a comedian. He was a performance artist, a song and dance man, born in 1949 and performing until his death in 1984. More on that later. Andy often mingled reality and fiction, just as he liked to mix his characters with his real-life persona. Some people who knew him said that they believed he was never out of character. When Jim Carrey was cast to play Kaufman in the 1999 film Man on the Moon, Jim decided to perform an extreme version of method acting, never breaking character for the entire duration of the shoot. And at the end of it all, he wasn't really even sure who he was anymore. So first off, let's talk a little bit more about Andy Kaufman and what made his approach to life so unusual and unique. In watching these movies and kind of diving into Andy's world a little bit, what do you guys think of him? What do we make of Andy Kaufman?
I think he's fantastic. That's the first thing. His style of comedy and art is just so off the wall. I couldn't have imagined it before I saw what he was like.
Can you talk a little bit more about his style?
Okay, so there's one famous bit he did where he comes onto the Tonight Show, I think it's with Johnny Carson. So he comes out and he's doing sort of nothing. He just plays this clip, this song, the theme song from Mighty Mouse, and he's just standing there looking like he doesn't know what he's doing, and it just fills in the one bit where Mighty Mouse is singing in the song. And it's hard to explain because it is so hilarious, but it doesn't make any sense at all. It's like watching somebody playing, like messing around in their own living room or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I do think that he looked a little bit more like he knew what was going on than Jim Carrey did in the recreation. Jim Carrey makes it look like, oh my God, I'm so nervous and I have no idea what's happening. And, hopefully just something happens that I can, here's the line that I know. And then he sings it. But when I went back and looked at the Andy Kaufman clip, of the exact same thing, he looks a lot more confident. He's kind of just like waiting. He's just looking around at the crowd, hey, what's going on? Oh, here's my line, but yeah, I totally agree that it is like, it's kind of absurd comedy in a way where it's not funny because it's funny. It's funny because it's absurd or something like that.
Yeah, so Andy had a quote about himself. He said something, I just want real reactions. I want people to laugh from the gut, be sad from the gut, or get angry from the gut. Some people say he wasn't even necessarily a comedian because he also did a lot of things that to many people weren't funny, or maybe it was only kind of funny if you took the broad view of it. Like it was funny that he did that, but maybe the performance itself wasn't so funny. Like reading the entire Great Gatsby in front of an audience that he didn't like so much instead of doing anything else for the entire show.
Right, exactly. It's almost like the reason why he's funny is because you're sitting there going, oh my God, I can't believe he's doing this. And so there's all this tension. Whereas with just a normal comedic performance, they'd be telling jokes or doing impressions or something like that. And you'd be laughing because of the content of the show rather than the delivery, I guess.
I don't know, like, it seems to me in the parts that people found funny about Kaufman's performance, like the Mighty Mouse bit, It seems like when like humor is about having there be like a surprise, like having there be a sudden shift, like a sudden surprising shift, like with a joke, like when you expect it to be at one at one conceptual level and then suddenly it's at a different conceptual level, and that's funny. It seems like with the Mighty Mouse bit, what's funny about it is that he's like up there on stage and his whole body language is very like nervous and submissive, and he's like looking like glancing from back to forth and like twitching around like nervously, and takes like a nervous sip of water and seems very like this like on like kind of low status character. And then he suddenly, the line that he performs, like it wouldn't have been so funny if it was a different line, but like it's such like a heroic, he basically plays like a ultra confident heroic character just for that moment, and then he goes back to his other character, and that's what's funny about it, right?
Right. And actually that's the same thing that's funny about his Elvis Presley impression, because he goes, he starts out the bit being Latka, and he's like, hello, I am do impression, you know, like he has really bad grammar, and he like tells people like who he's going to do an impression of before doing it. And he's this very meek, you know, small character. And then he turns on the tape, and it's the, you know, I forget what that song is from, but like the, you know, da 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 da.
Yes, Thus Spake Zarathustra.
Thus Spake Zarathustra. Yeah, exactly. So he gets that music, and then he's like, you know, combing his hair and putting on the Elvis jacket, and then he turns around and he's like Elvis, right? And it's just like, you know, the most, you know, like confident performance of an Elvis song. He's dancing around, and then the song ends, and he goes back into being, you know, his little meek, you know, thank you very much. And yeah, you're right. That's exactly what makes it hilarious, is there's that massive shift between uncertain and extreme confidence.
And then there's kind of the other style of stuff that he did, like later on, the whole playing a horrible wrestling villain type character, where you don't even know if he's playing a character there, and a lot of people thought that he wasn't, where he's basically playing an extremely sexist version of himself who wants to wrestle women, and says, you know, he wants to prove that women's place is in the kitchen, and like see if any woman can actually come and challenge him to wrestling. And of course, because he's a guy, like he just beats woman after woman after woman after woman in wrestling, like over the course of months, which is a very different style of humor, if you can call it that.
It seems to me like it's still operating off the same basic principle, like breaking expectations. But it's like where most humorists break expectations and they like stay within like a certain box of, they're still on stage, like in the frame of like being a comedian, making jokes about like pop culture or whatever. Like he just goes completely outside the frame when he breaks expectations. And that's what makes his humor so surprising.
I think what makes his wrestling against women thing funny is that he's so clearly trying to piss off all of the women, and they're being pissed off anyway, right? Like he's he's trying to get their goat, and then it completely works, right? And so to somebody in the audience, or maybe to him, you know, he's probably getting a thrill out of it, and they're probably mad. But anybody sort of a third party passive observer who's watching it might think that it's funny, just because, wow, like what is this guy doing? You know, like this is so ridiculous.
Well, that's why the wrestling is was such a perfect outlet for him, because there is that blurring of the lines a bit with the lucha libre. Like, have you guys ever been to lucha libre in Mexico? Yeah,
I went once, and pro wrestling in the U.S. is the same. There's that
right.
That kayfabe is what they call it.
Kayfabe? What does that mean?
Yeah, there's a great article on Wikipedia about kayfabe, and it's basically the multi-layered reality in pro wrestling. And I'm sure this is why Andy Kaufman was drawn to pro wrestling, because there's the skin level story, which is, you know, two guys are duking it out, right? And they probably have some kind of beef, right? And then there's, you know, just under that, which is, okay, well, there's a script, obviously, and, you know, like this move is supposed to happen at this time, and you know, this guy is supposed to get away, and, you know, there's a there's a big tense moment or something like that, but of course they're all prepared for it beforehand. And then there's other layers below that, and I think that's what Andy Kaufman was going for. He was kind of just like, wait a minute, what I do is basically professional wrestling, except like I clearly can't fight. I'm clearly not big and strong enough to actually be a character in this process.
So in one interview, he tells about going into a club, and he gets up and he does the first 3 minutes of his act, and maybe he was even telling jokes in this act. And then at one point he's like, "Oh, geez, I'm so sorry. I'm just so nervous. You guys have put me off so much. I'll have to start my whole act again." And he went he went through and started from the beginning, and the whole audience was applauding and laughing. They loved it and they understood it. But he said the manager of the club didn't get it at all. And maybe that's part of what you guys are saying is too, because it's like this divisive thing where if you get it, you really get it. But if you don't get it, then you're in the out group.
Yeah, and you might even be like mad because you're like, why is this person wasting my time?
And the fact that you are mad is like part of the joke to the people that get it.
Right, exactly. And to Andy Kaufman, because he's hoping to get the reaction. I mean, it's kind of like in Man on the Moon, where I'm not sure if this really happened in real life, but Danny DeVito's character, George Shapiro, I guess, is telling Andy Kaufman, like, "Hey man, like you got to stop it with this wrestling women thing. I think women are going to start picketing or something like that if you keep going." And he's like, "Oh, do you think they will?" And he's like all hopeful and happy sounding. You can tell he's enjoying like riling people up and getting them pissed off about something.
Man on the Moon, by the way, is the biopic of Andy Kaufman, where Andy is played by Jim Carrey, which we'll be talking about a lot later. Yeah. So another character that I think is important to talk about if we're going to be talking about Andy Kaufman is Tony Clifton. What do you guys think of Tony Clifton, Andy Kaufman's kind of horrible Vegas
The bomb.
bar singer alter ego?
I don't especially like the character because it seems like it's just so one-dimensional, but sometimes he does some things that are really ridiculous. It's just obnoxious to the audience and to plants in the audience. So it's kind of funny, and it's like a big practical joke on the audience in some cases.
Yeah. Like Tony Clifton is terrible at singing, on his face. He's mean to everybody. He's always drunk. He's always in a bad mood. He is late to everything. And of course, he's just this fake character that Andy Kaufman and his friend Bob Zmuda, and maybe occasionally other people play, because, he's got all this makeup and he's got this costume and he's got sunglasses, and it doesn't really need to be the same person playing him every time. And so what I noticed is, despite him being basically a terrible person, he gets away with everything. He gets away with one time in the Jim and Andy, behind the scenes, whatever we want to call that, where Jim is playing Andy Kaufman, and so they at one point they invite Jim Carrey to the Playboy Mansion, right? And so Tony Clifton shows up, and they're all like, "Oh, welcome, Tony Clifton," because they all think it's Jim Carrey. And so he's just hanging around with all the the Playboy playmates, and like partying and getting drunk and having a good time. And then the real Jim Carrey shows up. The real Jim Carrey. It's just regular Jim Carrey without a costume. And so they end up kicking out Tony Clifton. And it's just it just struck me as like, wow, basically, like, how did he even get here? He's a fake person that doesn't really exist, and he's terrible at singing. He doesn't do anything valuable for anybody, and yet he's treated like a VIP, And it's kind of like Andy Kaufman was like trying to show that, like what can I get away with? Like how terrible of a person can I be, and I still get invited to stuff,
That's funny. I like that Robert Anton Wilson quote where he always used to say, "Reality is what you can get away with." So I guess Andy Kaufman was demonstrating that.
Yeah, great quote for Andy Kaufman.
Yeah, definitely in some ways, because I think the interesting thing about Tony Clifton, like you said, Kurt, he was kind of a one-dimensional, just awful character who was supposed to be a Vegas showman, but he was a horrible singer and like extremely rude to the audience. But what was so interesting about him was Andy kind of set him up as a character separate from him and like put in the terms of his contract for the Taxi sitcom that Tony Clifton had to be able to make appearances and stuff like that. And he dressed up so much while he was playing this character that people weren't really sure if it was him or it wasn't him. And then as soon as everybody, got the message that Tony Clifton was an Andy Kaufman character, then he started playing with it by hiring other people to play Tony Clifton so that he could like crash Tony Clifton's shows and basically just mess with everybody even more. So he got away with a lot with that character, like a lot of really awful comments towards people. And it's interesting to see.
But notice how we're still kind of amused. We're still kind of like, yeah, haha, how did he got away with that?
Why is it funny? Like Tony Clifton, like what is funny about that character?
Like I said, I think it's because he manages to get away with so much stuff and he's just the worst person ever. And if society worked properly, then that wouldn't be able to happen. And so I think it's almost like a commentary on like, haha, like, look at all this horrible stuff I can get away with. And like, nobody can stop me because society is basically broken or basically people don't have a defense against this.
I don't know if that's it though, because it seems like the whole point is kind of to get people like seriously pissed off, like to break the frame of the show. Like when he goes and like pours water on what's that guy, Bob Smuda? Like when he pours water on his head and then everyone kind of gets really pissed off and starts booing and he gets pissed at the audience. Like that's not really him getting away with it. That's like he's provoking a reaction, but it's not humor. It's like at what level is it funny? Is it funny at like a meta level?
Yeah, exactly. I think people who are not in the audience are people who are not like the people who are booing and getting mad are the product. They're the product that Andy is selling. Like the people who are being amused are Andy and anybody kind of outside who's looking in, right? And you can see this in the scene where Andy Kaufman starts a fight with I guess the new version where Jim Carrey is playing Andy Kaufman, you can see it better, where they have that kind of older manager guy. Who's the setup is they're all supposed to be in this restaurant and they're all kind of sneaking off to go get high in the bathroom, and Andy Kaufman
it's a Saturday Night Live skit.
Yeah.
It was actually he made an appearance on Fridays.
Yeah, on some Fridays,
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, so you can kind of see this effect where some people they think it's funny because they're like, haha, look at this. It's like he's riling people up. And like the manager who at the beginning of the movie or at the beginning of it's hard to talk about this because there's two different versions, but basically there's the manager who at the beginning is kind of like, what? He's talking to Danny DeVito's character. And he's like, what? Like, who is this guy? He doesn't quite get it. But then by the time that they do the scene with the weed where, the other guy at the table comes over and gives Andy the cue cards, and then Andy like throws his water at the guy, and then they all get into a big fight. The manager is like in the back, and he's like kind of laughing. He's like, haha, yeah. And then Andy comes back on the camera, and they ask him to apologize and say that it was all made up. And he doesn't. He refuses to do that. And he's like, oh, they're trying to get me to say it was all made up. And then at that point, that's when the manager gets mad. So it's kind of like his audience he's constantly trying to grow the number of people that he kind of captures.
I think it is an interesting question, though. Is it funny? Because he did actually piss a lot of people off, and he didn't really say that he was a comedian. He said he was a performance artist and was also interested in the angry reaction. And like, not to mention the fact, Andy Kaufman wasn't extremely popular. Like, he was extremely popular among some people, and some people consider him a genius. And like, I consider him a genius, but I don't know, like maybe he was also kind of an asshole. He did get kicked off of Saturday Night Live. his wrestling women was really unpopular. So we can't just declare that it was funny to everybody. I mean, it was, he genuinely did piss a lot of people off. And there's kind of like this question of, you know, when somebody's joking around with you in a friendly way and kind of picking on you, and it's funny for a while, and then eventually it can become not funny. And they'll say like, what, can't you take a joke? At a certain point, if you're just messing with people so much, is it actually a joke, or are you kind of being an asshole? If you're purposefully provoking people to anger all the time, like, how much can we say that that is a joke or not?
Well, and I think that's also part of it. I think it's also kind of a meta joke where the joke is this a joke, or am I just an asshole? And I definitely agree with you that probably most people would not think that Andy Kaufman was funny. And I think that even fewer people would think that Jim Carrey's recreation of Andy Kaufman was funny. That's just...
Funny at the time, or funny now after, you know, so much perspective, so much time has passed?
Well, I see them kind of the same, I guess. Like, I don't see it differently now that a lot of time has passed.
Could I want to interject with a question to kind of extend off of Kurt's point, and then maybe push back against Chris, your comment about the meta humor structure. And you said that you didn't you don't see that it's very different now that a lot of time has passed. But you know, I guess, you know, I'm guessing you weren't around for like the first iteration of Kaufman's, you know, comedy bit, and I'm not sure. I didn't see any evidence in some of the documentaries and some of the follow-up work or the interviews that Andy had a long-term view of how people were going to be analyzing his work in the future. And maybe I missed it because there was a lot of content, but it seemed like, you know, this conversation about him being a performance artist and really trying to manipulate the audience to get a certain reaction, I think that view is more plausible from a future perspective, looking back at him. But I would actually guess, and I'm wondering what you guys think about this, is how much of his efforts to just get a rise out of people was really more an attempt to connect with literally anybody, whether that was getting punched in the face or trying to get somebody to empathize with him to figure out what was going on. I mean, like when I look back at him, I you know, didn't laugh at a lot of his antics, and I generally don't click with absurdist kind of humor structures. But it seems to me he was just like a guy in a lot of pain who was disassociating most of the time. And then people didn't know how to behave that way or behave around him. And so they were making a lot of allowances for a very intelligent person that was breaking social norms. But I didn't hear too many people retrospectively saying, oh, I enjoyed my interactions with Andy, or, you know, any of his alter egos and so on. I guess I'm wondering how you guys view his antics, maybe less as like a grand puppeteering structure where he's manipulating the audience to behave and question the relationship between humor and antagonism, like a pain person kind of acting out.
I definitely think that you hit the nail on the head. I mean, I definitely think that you're correct, that he was probably trying to connect with people in any way that he could. And I think that's how a lot of you know, you see people like this, you know, here and there. So I don't know if we're supposed to talk about, is this pathological yet, but I'm just going to jump into it. I think that it is pathological, like you were saying, Dan, but pathology is not necessarily maladaptive, which is to say, like, this is a behavior that he learned as a young child because it worked for him. You know, it got the result that he was looking for. And so he learned to do it more and more and more. And with the rise of mass media, with the rise of television, he was able to basically get his name out there and become this famous person, regardless of whether he was actually good or regardless of whether he was actually funny. And I think that I hate to bring this up, but like the Trump phenomenon is pretty much the same thing. It's basically, you know, this guy who nobody really likes and nobody wants to do business with. And yet he's able to use the fact that he's famous to basically get whatever he wants.
I don't know. I kind of disagree. Like, I sort of think the psychology that Dan and then Chris was describing seems more like the Jim Carrey psychology, like trying to connect with people at all costs. It seems to me like Andy Kaufman had a pretty different intent. Like from what I can tell, it seems that he treated, I don't necessarily see that his performances were geared towards any kind of audience, either in his own time or in the future. It seemed more like he was using other people as like props in this like thing he was creating that wasn't really for anyone. He was just creating it because he found it, I don't know, for some unclear motivation.
But isn't that how all art is? Like, isn't art at the end of the day for the benefit of the artist? I mean,
I don't even necessarily know that he was creating it for himself. It seemed like he was just creating it without any kind of regard for an audience. And most, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question. Like, is most art created for an audience or not?
So maybe this would be a good time to transition into talking about Jim Carrey a little bit, because we've kind of alluded to it. But Jim Carrey is another interesting character as a human being, but also particularly in the way that he played Andy Kaufman. In 1999, there was a biopic made of Andy Kaufman where Jim Carrey was playing him called Man on the Moon. And that's named after an REM song that was written about Andy Kaufman. So Jim Carrey played Andy Kaufman in this movie, and it wasn't so well known until recently. I think this came out a couple of years ago, where Netflix actually created a documentary with a lot of the behind the scenes footage of Jim Carrey playing Andy Kaufman. This one is called Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond. And so when Jim Carrey played Andy, Jim basically decided to just enter into like a full method acting Andy Kaufman, Tony Clifton trance for like the whole duration of the shoot. And he definitely interpreted Andy in his own way. Like you can see in the movie that he plays him a little bit differently. And he interacted with everybody from like his fellow actors to people on and off set to people at parties as this wild Andy Kaufman, Tony Clifton. Yeah, Andy's family, Andy's girlfriend, with everyone as his interpretation of Andy. And he did a very similar thing both on and off camera, where he was playing with pissing people off and messing with reality and messing with identity. And Ariel, you were saying that you consider Jim Carrey's portrayal maybe a little bit more pathological than Andy's actual character was. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
That's not really what I was saying. I wasn't saying necessarily that Jim Carrey was more pathological. I just think that the psychology that Chris and Dan were describing, like someone who's desperate to connect and desperate to be like and going on all these antics because they really want people to love them and to like them, it seems a lot more similar to Jim Carrey, especially like young Jim Carrey, than to Andy Kaufman. I think Andy Kaufman's on a completely different trip. Not necessarily a less pathological one, but different.
I think this is important because comedians talk about this, like Joe Rogan talks about this, and he mentioned it with a lot of comedians where they get into it because they're trying to be liked. Or Robin Williams is another example. He was really trying to please his stepmother. Like the only way that he found he could stop his stepmother being angry at him and treating him cruelly was to make her laugh. So he just turned into this dancing monkey. And a lot of comedians go on that path, and even artists in general. It's like they're trying to get acceptance, and then if they have a little self-actualization, at some point they turn and they say, I'm complete now. I'm a full person. I don't crave acceptance anymore, but I'm going to take this seriously as an art form. And I wonder, the way that Jim talks in the old footage, you can hear him talking about himself. Like as Tony Clifton, he says, I don't know about that Jim Carrey guy. He smiles too much. That's not natural, and stuff like that. You can hear that he's talking about himself like a broken man. But now I'd say he's probably more complete.
I want to just read a Jim Carrey quote. This is something after he filmed Man on the Moon. He said, Jim Carrey was a great character, and I was lucky to get the part. This was when he was on Jimmy Kimmel a couple years ago. And he says, but I don't think of that as me anymore. So he says, Jim Carrey was a great character. I was lucky to get the part, but I don't think of that as me anymore. And I don't know how much that has to do just with him playing Andy Kaufman and messing with his concept of self for so long, or whether it was outside of that also. But I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, well, he has a couple of bits. One bit he did, he was talking about going to the dentist and having the laughing gas and having this psychedelic experience and sort of little ego death experience while high. And there's a few things like that he talks about.
Yeah, sorry, Jim Carrey mentioned that in the Jim and Andy documentary?
No, that was that's a separate bit that he did.
Yeah, there's been other things that he's done recently. Like I think it was maybe a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. There was kind of an infamous interview on E News. I don't know if you ever saw that, but it was a red carpet interview. The girl comes up to him and asks him about what he's wearing, and he starts talking about like, what am I wearing? Like, I don't even exist. None of this exists. None of this matters. And she's just left absolutely speechless. Like Jim Carrey is clearly in a different kind of place. He has another quote. He says, "I've stepped through the door. The door is the realization that us is Seaside. It's the dumb. It's the dumb. This isn't real. This is a story." And like Seaside is the town that the Truman Show took place in, which, yeah, the movie where basically he was a character living in a completely artificial, constructed reality.
It's interesting because like Andy Kaufman seems to have, like he says a similar thing in Man on the Moon. He says something like, none of this is real. And it seems to me that like that was kind of a premise to everything that he was doing. Like he didn't treat the people around him as real people. He didn't treat the world as real. He treated it like almost like a beautiful creation that he was contributing to.
What do you think of that perspective? Like the perspective of looking at the world as some kind of a creation that you can participate in and mold.
I mean, so Jim Carrey said something like in Jim and Andy, he said, like, what is this? You come into this world and you're a citizen of a particular group of people, and you like your parents probably teach you about some God and some like religious beliefs, and you have all this stuff that just gets programmed into you, and like, is any of that actually part of who I am? Is any of that actually real? And well, in my opinion, some of that is real. Some of that traditional stuff that we pass down to our kids is there because it's useful. It does tell us something about ourselves. But on the other hand, I think Jim Carrey is right that we can't just accept everything that society tells us about ourselves and just be that. There is a process of sort of, I guess, becoming an adult or becoming who you are, where you take the best stuff of what you were taught, and then you kind of you synthesize that into a new version of you that you created.
Yeah, it seems like that kind of perspective, that to take your identity a little bit more loosely and to be able to like inhabit other personas, like in that book by Keith Johnson, like it seems like there's a lot of value in that, and that can help you become like a more spontaneous artistic person. But at the same time, it also seems to me that if you take it to an extreme and say that like the world isn't real, other people aren't real, none of this really matters, like that's, and at a certain point it becomes identical with psychopathy. Like that's what psychopathy is. Like you treat other people like they're not real. You, like, psychopaths don't react. Like if they get pulled over by the police, like most people when they get pulled over by the police, like their heart starts racing and they start sweating, but psychopaths just don't react. Like whatever happens, they don't get anxious because it's like they're not treating the world as as real. They're not treating other people as real.
Yeah, it's almost kind of like when you're in a video game and you you find like God mode or something like that, or you find a cheat, and everything kind of becomes less real, right? And everything becomes kind of less meaningful.
Because there's no stakes, no skin in the game.
Exactly. There's no skin in the game. That's exactly right. So you're like, well, if I screw this up, then, well, I'll just reincarnate, in the same place, and everything will be, I'll just try again, but it does kind of ruin the game a little bit to, I don't know, to activate a cheat. Now, of course, that raises the question, did Jim Carrey or Andy Kaufman like activate some kind of cheat in life? Maybe the cheat is, we don't have to do any of this stuff. We don't have to follow the regular rules that everybody is following. And I think that is part of what Ariel was referring to when she was talking about psychopathy. It's kind of like, well, you're actually a lot less free when you commit to following the rules that everybody else is following. So if you just decide not to follow, the rules of society, then that gives you a lot more freedom. But at the same time, people aren't going to like that. and yeah, you're probably some kind of psychopath.
So I found it interesting that you mentioned reincarnation, because like both in things that Jim Carrey has said, like talking about just the way that he approaches life and kind of the vibe that I get from him, and also the fact that Andy Kaufman was really into transcendental meditation. Like I think they've both been influenced kind of by some Eastern philosophy. And I'm thinking about like myself, when I've practiced some mindfulness meditation, like a lot of what I'm training myself to do, and a lot of what people are training themselves to do, is to not react, to just like be in the world and observe it. I wouldn't say detach, but like be present and observe yourself and observe the world. And I was thinking about myself, if I got pulled over by a police officer, depending on what state of mind I was in, I might not react, and I wouldn't consider myself a psychopath. But I guess to an extent, when you were saying like not having skin in the game, or just kind of observing and not necessarily playing by the rules, like a lot of that is those are traits that I've kind of purposely tried to cultivate in myself in order to be able to play like a meta game, or to live in a different way. Is that necessarily a bad thing?
Well, obviously there's two extremes here, right? There's the kind of, everything traditional, everything that your parents taught you, everything society tells you is right. And nothing that you think or say or do actually matters. You should, well, nothing that you do or say. Like, I guess, like everything does matter. Actually, it does matter if you break the rules, and you should be extremely afraid whenever you see a police officer pull you over. And you should, there's kind of an extreme on that end where like you have no freedom, right? And you're just following the rules of the game as best as you can. And, you're basically trying to avoid breaking the rules at all costs. And then on the other end of the spectrum is Jim Carrey, where you just have reality is whatever you make it. There really isn't, there really aren't rules. And if there are, then you're just imagining them, and you can definitely break them, and you should break them. Because when you do that, you're increasing your own freedom and you're expanding your identity. And, I think that these two are opposite ends of the spectrum. And I think probably too far in either direction is bad, but somewhere in the middle is probably okay.
This is actually the plot to Crime and Punishment. Like what happens in that book is basically the main character is this guy, Raskolnikov, and he decides to commit this murder. He wants to become someone who is not bound by the rules of convention and the rules of society, and someone who is able to act freely in his own right, kind of like an Ubermensch before the concept existed. And so he plans this murder. And the idea behind the murder is that it's like a completely justified murder against this awful person, and he'll be able to, because of the money he'll get from committing the murder, he'll be able to do all this good, so he totally justifies it. And after he commits the murder, He realizes why those rules were in place to begin with.
Yeah, it does seem like a similar situation. I haven't read Crime and Punishment, but I've heard that it doesn't quite work out how he wants it to work out.
I mean, the basic idea is that at a certain point, if you, like, the rules are there for a reason, and the reason's not always obvious. And once you start breaking the rules left and right, you can mess up reality in a way that you can't necessarily predict.
So we're talking a lot about the dark sides. Crime and Punishment is interesting. I haven't read it, but it was interesting to me that you mentioned that he was doing it for a quote unquote good purpose, like a just murder. I don't know if I would agree with that concept, but I think that this rule breaking can be used in really positive ways too. Like if you take an approach to life where maybe you are on a mission to do a lot of good in the world. And I'm not talking about breaking rules like ethical rules, like not committing murder or things like that, but just breaking general kind of unspoken societal rules, like someone like Andy did a lot of, like playing characters in the street, putting on fun accents to please people, or not necessarily being not being dragged down by incidents that we would normally consider as negative. Like if you lose your job or something like that, having a kind of mindset where you're able to still be happy in that situation and see it as just like a small step back in the game, I think could be really helpful if you're trying to get somewhere. Like if you're trying to do something really big in the world, you have to kind of break a lot of societal norms, because societal rules don't really, the unspoken ones don't really allow people to be loud or make any kind of ripples whatsoever. So I don't think it necessarily has to go in a bad direction.
Well, and I think just in general in life, if you're doing exactly the same thing that everybody else is doing, then you're not gonna, there's a ceiling to how much success you can actually have. In order to, no risk, no reward, that type of thing. If you're following everybody else's behavior, you're basically you're treating your life, you're behaving as though you don't want to take any risks, basically, or you're not taking any risks. And when you do that, yeah, you're limiting how much reward you can actually get. And so it's in my view, it's almost kind of required to break some rules so that you can be more successful than everybody else. So, obviously you can go too far and you break, sort of really, really bad rules, or you can break rules in a really, really bad way. And then you can limit your success by going too far as well. So I definitely think there's like a happy medium where you break some rules, you break the rules that you can basically that benefit you a lot to break and don't actually hurt other people for you to break.
So do we think that Andy Kaufman and Jim Carrey went too far and broke these rules? I guess we could go one by one. Like, I think in both cases, obviously Andy Kaufman and Jim Carrey, at least in my view, are pretty great people and influential people that changed a lot of things in positive ways. But then there's also some things that are pretty dark about some of the actions that we took. Like, do you think that overall their behavior was pathological, or was just they were playing a different kind of game and demonstrating a different way to live that was overall good?
I mean, one thing that's interesting also in Crime and Punishment is the main character puts forward this idea that there are like great men, and that if you're destined for greatness, it's okay to break the normal rules, but that most people should follow the normal rules. And it's almost like, it almost seems like, as unappealing as that idea is, it almost seems like we do kind of hold it as a society. Like if you look at people like Andy Kaufman or Jim Carrey, like Andy Kaufman in particular, but like he broke a lot of rules and he was an asshole in a lot of situations, but he did great things. Like it worked. Whereas if you look at someone who is disruptive and acts like a jerk and it just doesn't work and they just end up like not producing anything and no one finds it appealing, then people are we're kind of less forgiving of that.
Yeah, exactly. People are just like, wow, what a jerk. People don't sit there and go, well, at least he tried. Like if you break a bunch of rules and then fail, then yeah, people will just be like, wow, what an asshole. But you're right. If it works, then you can, that's kind of ties into what I was saying before. Like you're taking a risk basically, but you can end up like way, way out ahead if your risk pays off.
So are we basically saying that we think that Andy Kaufman was cool because he succeeded?
I mean, it's not irrelevant.
Yeah, it's not.
So, and this ties into what I was saying earlier with sort of psychopathology being adaptive. Like, like, was he a great person? I don't know, but he definitely was rich and successful and made a big impact on things, and probably did actually end up destroying some of the rules that had previously been in place and increased the freedom of future performers. So, you could say you could have the same argument about basically anybody famous ever in history. I mean, we can look at conquerors and politicians and statesmen and inventors. A lot of them, you start looking back in their history and you're like, wow, this person was a dick, but somehow they leave this mark on humanity, and people like forget the bad stuff. It's weird.
It's like Steve Jobs is a great example. Like he was such a dick. Like he was Steve Jobs, right? Like if if there had just been the asshole stuff and there hadn't been all the amazing stuff, and he had been like, I don't know, unemployed and whatever, people, wouldn't be remembered well.
That's a good point. I think maybe it's a little bit different in Andy's case, because in Andy's case, like a lot of what made him famous and a lot of his greatness was in being a dick. Like, like playing the dick was the thing, because it was almost like, kind of like we said about the wrestling, it was like almost like a commentary on how people can get away with being dicks, maybe. But then maybe, like Dan said, maybe we're just reading too much into him. I do tend to think, though, that he was maybe not planning out how people would think about him in the future and like thinking about his legacy, but I think that he was consciously playing with societal rules. I don't think he was just an ass. I think he was poking at and toying with these things on purpose in order to kind of criticize them and explore them.
It's kind of a social norm hacker.
But they're always interconnected, though, like the greatness and the assholery. Like if Napoleon had been too soft-hearted to send an army out to war, he wouldn't have been Napoleon, right? But maybe what makes Andy different is he was more conscious of it.
Well, yeah, but also a lot of people died because of Napoleon. I mean, he was a great person, in a sense, because he did big things. But the bad stuff that he did was maybe balanced out, or balanced out the good stuff that he did. It's hard to say, like, did he do more good than bad in the end?
I would judge Napoleon pretty harshly.
I mean, a lot
maybe
of the things.
We want to parse out the way that we're using great to mean like noteworthy versus like ethically good or produced positive effects for society as a whole.
Well, and I think most people actually do conflate those things. People look back and read about somebody in history and they kind of assume, oh yeah, this person was a great guy because he was on the right side of history.
That's a good point. I think that we were kind of conflating that in this conversation. So when we say great, I think we're talking about large and impactful, not necessarily like Genghis Khan was also great. Genghis Khan is somebody that history tends to judge super harshly. Maybe they'll say that he was great, but a great man, but not a great guy,
Yeah.
It's a complicated relationship, right? It's great. It means big, but it also kind of means successful. And you can argue that to be successful, you have to create systems that benefit people. Like, we don't like that Napoleon was responsible for a lot of death, but if it wasn't for the Napoleonic Code, you wouldn't have like civil rights and stuff like that as we know them today.
Very true.
Ooh, that's weird.
I wanted to bring up that I know maybe you guys took some issue with this when I brought it up earlier, but I feel like that Andy Kaufman and Jim Carrey and these they're kind of like these trickster characters or jester characters where they're explicitly not in charge. They're not the king, right? They don't have any responsibility other than their job is to entertain people. And a lot of times what the way that they do this is by kind of making fun of the king, right? Is kind of like poking fun at the king or like saying something that Just basically being honest and telling the truth. And yeah, I feel like when you break the rules in service of the truth, that people look a lot more kindly on that than just breaking the rules for the sake of breaking the rules. And so I think, like, if there's some greater truth that's being revealed by Andy Kaufman's behavior or Jim Carrey's behavior, then people, to the degree that they're being honest and truthful, I think people look with favor on them.
Well, what greater truth was Andy Kaufman revealing?
I think Andy Kaufman and Jim Carrey were both revealing the greater truth of this perspective, that in one sense it is kind of all a game, and you can make life whatever you want it to be, and you can be whoever you want to be, and you can change that consciously, that you can step outside of the box, not just of like normal societal prescriptive behavior, but even outside of the box of like what we normally think of as the self and identity. I think that's a lot of what they were good for, they were great for.
I guess when you say that that's a truth, do you mean that is like a truth, or it's an important perspective, or do you think it is like the truth?
I think it's a truth and an important perspective. I don't think that it's any less true than the perspective that most of us take every day. And maybe to me, I think it's equally as important, but I don't think it's the truth.
Yeah, I think maybe another way to put that would be that Andy Kaufman opened the door for people like Jim Carrey, and Jim Carrey opened the door for more people like that, I guess. Basically, they're showing people like, well, hey, I got away with it, so maybe you can too. They're not necessarily, a lot of people who are considered assholes or whatever are breaking the rules, and then other people aren't allowed to break the rules. We see this all the time in government. But if they're just getting up there going, hey, look at me, I'm breaking the rules, and you can too if you want, then I think they are actually, they're sort of corroding the structure of society a little bit. But maybe society has gotten past that tyrannical point where people are feeling their identity being repressed, and they're feeling like they can't do anything about it. And then maybe they see somebody like Andy Kaufman or Jim Carrey, and they get inspired, and they go, oh, actually I have this piece of myself that I've been dissociating with because I didn't like it. But really, who cares? I'm going to be me. So I think they, at least Jim Carrey sees himself as kind of expanding that flavor of freedom, but probably Andy Kaufman too.
I guess my question is, like, if you take that perspective and just be like, none of it's real, it's all a game, the other people aren't real, I'm just creating this happening, I'm creating these happenings with every moment, then why not discard moral rules? Why not be cruel and manipulative and even violent to other people?
I don't think that's quite the point. I guess you could take it to that level, but you don't have to, because the fact that life is a play of consciousness, or that that we're all actors, that all life is a stage and this sort of thing, it doesn't mean you disregard all the rules. You can, I guess you could if you wanted to. I mean, technically you can do anything you want, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the character you want to play. You don't necessarily want to accept the consequences of those things.
Ariel, I think that was an interesting question, but I think Andy actually did, right? He did all of the negative things that you talked about. He was aggressive towards people. He got into physical altercations, and Jim did the same thing when he was representing Andy. But one thing that I think differentiates Jim from Andy is that later on, like in his present affect, right? Jim has been pretty well known these days for occupying kind of a sort of a pseudo-Buddhist mindset about, just being part of a unified consciousness and disassociating from identity or societal restrictions. But he occupies a lot of practices that are consistent with like loving kindness meditations, where the rules that he's occupying are, occasionally he'll chime in on a social critique when like the president's being a dick. But a lot of his days are just making art and then getting in touch with people now, because he kind of saw that he occupied one end of the spectrum and kind of evolved past that. And I think that's one area where I'm able to, like, I'd be more willing to claim that Jim is playing a more positive societal role, whereas Andy's version, Chris made a point that Andy might have opened the door a little bit wider in American culture for these kind of absurdist jester archetypes. But there's others, those archetypes have been. I mean, the fact that we call it a jester archetype means that it's been around since at least the Middle Ages, right? And then there's other types of method actors that don't have as clear of an actor or an artistic hereditary link to Andy like Jim does. Like, you're still going to have your Daniel Day-Lewis's, your Heath Ledgers, and other people, and probably even Jim Carrey in a different version, right? We can imagine a counterfactual where, because of a lot of the fucked up shit that Jim had to deal with in his personal life, and the fact that he was dealing with depression and a whole host of other things, like, he would have found some creative outlet. He might not have had that particular role, and then some of the stuff that have followed immediately afterwards. But I think it's still pretty easy to see that type of expressiveness and rule challenge, like, other people all over the place still do that without needing the example of Andy, or an Andy kind of person who takes that creative challenge, but then actually kind of harms people that he's interacting with personally. And then, so that's why I kind of lean towards a negative, I guess, judgment of Andy in the way that he was performing. But yeah, just kind of wanted to say that, like, yeah, I think Andy's a good example, Ariel, of your point that, like, yeah, if you disregard all the rules, you turn into an asshole and you hurt people. And I think that's kind of what he did.
Well, Andy Kaufman wasn't disregarding all the rules. Like, he got into some physical altercations, but most of his physical altercations also were staged. Like, the whole Jerry Lawler wrestling conflict, like, Jerry was totally in on it. And when they were getting in physical fights, even like on Letterman, that was all staged. He wasn't a serial killer. He wasn't a murderer. Maybe he went further certainly than I would into the darkness, into the dark direction. But I don't think that we can just say that Andy Kaufman discarded all the rules and was a psychopath. I agree with Kurt though. Like, if you throw away, like, okay, first of all, if all of life is a stage and we're all actors, and you kind of take this perspective that we can do with life whatever we want, and that the universe is a canvas that we can paint on and create, you would have to be a special kind of person to say, wow, the world is a canvas, let me become a murderer. Like, why would you jump to that? Why would you go there? Because, like, this is a perspective that I take a lot. It's like, yeah, that's true. I can do whatever I want with my life. I don't have to follow this path. But I would never then think, so therefore I should become a serial killer, so therefore I should hurt people and become a rapist. It's more like, I can do whatever I want in this life and in this world, and I don't have to follow these norms or these rules. So let's try to make something as amazing and as beautiful as possible. And also, for me, when I take this perspective, and I would guess, I don't know what Andy thought, but with Jim also, he's clearly trying to get it out to people. It's not just, this isn't real and other people aren't real. It's also, this isn't real and other people aren't real and I'm not real. So let's play with it. And he's inviting others to play with it as well. It's not just using everybody as props in your own game. It's not everyone else is fake. It's, this is all a big fake soup, and let's make something out of it.
Yeah, I almost feel like, so you mentioned that Andy went to some really dark places, and I guess Jim Carrey as well. And it makes me think of Carl Jung's Shadow, where you have this kind of dark part of your personality, where you still have to acknowledge it and integrate it. You can't ignore it because it won't go away. And so, but when you acknowledge it and integrate it, it allows you to be creative in a much more positive way, I would say.
I mean, Katie, like, to respond to what you were just saying, it seems to me like that kind of perspective And I'm not saying it's a perspective that needs to be completely rejected or anything. It can be a useful mindset maybe, but it seems to me that that perspective places morality at the level of individual preference. So I'm going to decide not to murder people because it's not aesthetically appealing to me and it would dirty my canvas, and I'm just going to decide not to do that. But it seems to me that
I think if you have, unless you have an objective moral system coming down from a religious authority or something that you believe is capital T truth, then to an extent we all are creating our own values and our own systems of morality. And this perspective is just acknowledging that.
I don't really necessarily think that's the case. It seems that it lacks the humility to say, I'm creating the reality that I want to create, and the reality that I think is beautiful, and this universe is a canvas, and I'm going to do with it what I want. Like, it seems like, you know, it would be easy. It's you know, maybe we're not going to go like, okay, let's be murderers then, even though I could easily see that being something that someone, an aesthetics to add to their canvas, because why not, if you're not humbling yourself to anything else. But it could be very easy to be like, I'm just going to be a liar. Like, I can create, I open up so many more possibilities for my canvas if I'm going to be lying all the time.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't see it as my canvas. I see it as a canvas that all of us are co-creating. And like, I want my own contribution to that to be as awesome as possible. I mean, why would I want it to be bad? Like under any kind of system of morality, I think that aesthetics and personal preference plays a big role in the systems of morality that people choose. And like your orientation towards the world, whether you have a positive orientation towards the world or a negative orientation towards the world, isn't going to change whether you're a Christian or a nihilist. I think that's something deeper within the self and within the personality. Like, I could very easily be a person who believes very much in objective morality, and so my main purpose is to like try to shame people into following the objective morality so that they don't burn in hell, or, you know, to try to enforce these objective moral rules with complete disregard for whether or not they're helping people or whether it's destroying the world. Or you could be a complete subjectivist and not believe in morality at all, and so you're trying to just make the best thing possible because why not? Or you could flip it around and you could be like, you could very much believe in objective morality, and so you're trying to follow these rules and like make things like the perfect vision of whatever you believe the system to be. Or you could be a nihilist and become a serial killer, because why not? Like, let's just fuck everything. But I'm just saying that the motivation that would cause people to say, fuck everything, I want to murder and I want to be a liar and I want this canvas to be bloody doesn't have to do with the fact that the person sees themselves as an artist.
But they feed into each other. Like, you can't really say which one comes first. Like, if you look at the pathology of someone who's tyrannical, rule follower, a dogmatist versus someone who's, let's say, a scam artist because they're a total nihilist, which actually is very common. Like, you can say, you know, the nihilism attracted the person who had the scammy, manipulative tendencies. Maybe that's true, but it also feeds it. Like, it creates a feedback loop.
You can create feedback loops in either direction.
You can get feedback loops in either direction, but it's not like the ideological system is completely arbitrary. Like, you can see that there's ideological systems that pull people in who have specific kind of pathologies and then really feed those pathologies. Or even they can pull in people who are otherwise normal or who maybe wouldn't tend in that direction and still feed those kinds of pathologies or those kinds of personality traits.
Here's a couple of things. So one thing is, Ariel, I'm not entirely sure if you're making an argument from consequences. Like, if you're saying that, well, this belief has negative consequences and therefore I don't want to accept it. Well, maybe that's something to think about. Also, I like to think that morality is intersubjective. So it's not objective, and it's not completely objective. It's not completely subjective. It's a sort of negotiation. And that's why these things kind of work, like Andy Kaufman's actions and stuff. it kind of works because he can push the boundaries a little bit in one direction, and then everybody else has to say, well, yeah, I guess that is kind of moral, or it kind of isn't, And it's also about self-actualization. So when Maslow looked at self-actualized people, he found that a common trait was that they had very strict moral standards for themselves, but they weren't normal moral standards. They weren't standards adopted from society. So there were standards that they explored and thought about themselves and came up with themselves. And what else? Oh, the other thing you said about aesthetics. So it's not about aesthetics. Like aesthetics is part of it, but like when a self-actualized person decides, I'm going to tell the truth, or whatever their moral code says, aesthetics is part of it, but that's a superficial part, because what they're trying to do is create something congruent. It goes down all the way. So they try to find these principles which are beautiful and poetic, but they're also true on a deeper level. And so all of these several things are in line with their spirituality and the religion and all of these things.
Well, and I think the definition of beauty can be either superficial or deep as well, as you just inferred there, or implied there. That truth itself can be beautiful, and a lot of times that's how we come up with what we tell ourselves is true, like which thing is the most beautiful, or which one has the best consequences. Actually, I wasn't sure what you were talking about earlier when you talked about having an argument from consequences. Is that like a logical fallacy or something like that, because something has bad consequences that we should avoid it?
Yeah. So, well, it's a logical fallacy. An argument from consequences would be like, I won't accept that it's moral to allow people to carry firearms because I think that will result in more deaths, or something like that. So it's not based on the actual fact of the proposition. It's based on what you think will happen after that.
That example is tricky, because if you're a moral consequentialist, then that would that would work. But it's more like I don't accept that what you're saying is true because I don't like what it would imply if that were true.
Yes. Oh, here's a good example. So I don't believe in fate because I don't like to believe that I'm not in control of my own actions.
Right. This is a lot of the arguments that you see against fate or determinism are consequentialist in this way. Like determinism is false because that means free will doesn't exist. And it's like, well,
and I want to believe in free will, so I don't.
Right.
Okay. I see what you're saying. I thought you were saying that like looking at the consequences of past actions is irrelevant when evaluating the wiseness of current actions, and I feel like that's the only thing that you really can evaluate. Like, was this a good decision in the past?
It's not irrelevant, and also I don't know if it's necessarily a fallacy. Like, okay, how can I phrase this? It's ironic because if we were taking the position that reality is constructed and that we can paint whatever canvas we want, or this kind of metaphor, if we were taking that point of view, then an argument from consequences would be not a fallacy, I would think. You would say, okay, well, if reality is something that we create, and if taking the mindset that we're creating our own reality and not having any actual moral beliefs is going to lead to a bad reality, then we shouldn't then we shouldn't do that. It would work in that frame. But if you actually believe in like truth and morality, then I don't know if it would work in the same way.
Well, that would be an argument against believing in it. It wouldn't be an argument against being true. So those are two different.
I think that is kind of what we're discussing here, though, right? Like, we're not having a discussion of like, is reality a video game? What is the evidence that reality could be a video game?
That's usually what we're talking about.
Quantum physics. Like, it's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about this perspective that I think we all probably agree we can't know for sure one way or the other whether reality is a game and other people exist or not, and all this stuff. So should we like look through those goggles or not? And in what way should we do so? And maybe that would be something that's interesting to talk about in a more nuanced way, actually, because
Yeah, and I think Ariel, I've got a question for you because I mean I'm hearing your concern that there are potential negative consequences to the canvas approach to ethics or how people motivate themselves, but it seems that most of the disagreeable or bad stuff that has happened has occurred just kind of definitionally under very rigid social structures, and at least one of the benefits of people engaging in this canvas approach is then they would have to I think it lends itself a little bit more to some introspection, and then people have to actually do some potential examination about what kind of material they want to put on the canvas. So what I'd like to hear more from you about is your concern about why this type of canvas approach seems to have the potential for more negative consequences than a more rigid structural approach, which at least in my mind has more association with like all of the bad mass alignment stuff that's happened. And just as a final thread to pull in what Kurt said is like when people didn't like the negative consequences of what Andy was doing, I mean it was pretty easy for the community to kind of like shun him as an outsider, and then his impact was, I don't know, I think more limited until Jim Carrey came along and extended it, and then again until Netflix decided to make that documentary to bring him back into the spotlight to some degree. And so yeah, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that or could dig into that a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big part of the reason why most of the atrocities of history have been carried out by people operating under rigid belief structures, which I would to some extent question, because I think a lot of the atrocities of history were more motivated by desires for power and wealth than necessarily ideological rigidity. I think the reason why you see that, or because why ideological rigidity is more common historically than nihilism, is because we've been in the age of religion up until very, very recently. Like up until very, very recently, like in the pre-Enlightenment period, every society on earth was religious. It was just the default belief system. And it's only in the past 400 years, and really in the past 150 years, as far as the mass population goes, that we see that breaking down. That's like the death of God, which is a very recent phenomenon. So we would expect that if we look at the whole scope of history, you'd see more stuff that was religiously motivated than stuff that was nihilistically motivated. Although to some extent, I would question that, because I think that when people commit atrocities out of like a pure unbridled desire for power or pure unbridled desire for wealth or desire to, have rape lots of women after a conquest or something like that, like there is something nihilistic about that. Like there's something about that where
they always have a narrative to go with their atrocities, though. That's, some larger truth. Oh, God wants this to happen, or, the proletariat wants this to happen, or something.
I mean, nihilism is a narrative. You say nothing matters and I can do whatever I want to. And so
right, but that's never anybody's narrative. Like Genghis Khan didn't go and kill people and rape people because nothing matters. Like Hitler didn't start World War II because nihilism was like this big noble cause to him. It wasn't. Yeah, nihilism is never the official answer. It might be like deep inside if we were to go like analyze that person's intentions, but that's never the ostensible narrative.
A lot of people in modern times do very destructive things out of nihilism. Sometimes it is even the official narrative. Like if you look in the 1970s or like the French post-structuralists, they were circulating a petition trying to get rid of all age of consent laws in France because nothing matters and all social rules are arbitrary. So they wanted to make pederasty illegal. For example.
But those people, there are nihilists and they do tend to try to do things, but they tend to be less successful than the people who manage to get the public on their side.
I was just gonna say, I would argue a lot of the social breakdown we're seeing today is due to nihilism.
In the case of that French movement, did it actually gain traction? Because I think that's right.
That particular petition did not succeed, but that movement that way of thinking is behind. It's become very pervasive in society today.
Okay, so I want to propose a different thing. I don't think that Jim Carrey, I don't know about Andy Kaufman, but I don't think that what Jim Carrey is proposing or the kind of perspective that I like to take a lot is the same thing as nihilism. For me personally, this more creation perspective is the way through nihilism, because like God is dead. At least for me, I am not able to believe in a rigid moral structure being absolute truth, because I think it's disprovable, at least to me. And so I struggled with that for a long time. Like, is everything meaningless? And then there's a way to get to the other side of that of, okay, maybe in one sense we could say it's meaningless, but in the other sense we could frame it as potential. Everything is potential, and it's potential for good. And it's not just nobody else exists. And none of this really matters. It's like we're living in a grand universe where maybe none of us matter to the grand scheme. Maybe we do, it's possible. But in this perspective, none of us matter to the grand scheme, but it's something that has a lot of potential because it all matters to each of us, and we can create something beautiful out of it. And I think that's very distinct from nihilism. And I don't think that we should be lumping them together just because it goes through nihilism to get there. I think it's the solution to nihilism. I don't think that you're going to be able to send society back into a religious way of thinking, because I don't know. I don't think it's going to work. I don't think people are going to buy that anymore. I think that human knowledge has gotten to a point where these kinds of rigid structures aren't going to hold. But maybe this new agey, quasi-Buddhist, whatever, Jim Carrey philosophy could develop into something beautiful that could bring us forward.
I mean, I'm going to say, I also feel that you're mischaracterizing what I'm saying, kind of. I'm not arguing for a return to like rigid religious fundamentalism, but I would ask you to clarify a little bit more, like, what is this solution that you're putting forward, this like Buddhist potential focused solution to nihilism?
Basically, okay, so yeah, sorry, I know you're not a religious fundamentalist, but basically the idea of having like objective morality. I would say that, well, it's still developing.
Yeah, so the nihilism, sometimes you might call this the dark night of the soul. So this is when someone enters the level of despair, and they realize, hey, everything is meaningless. Like, what am I doing here? As some people call this existentialist dread. And then when you go through that for a while, hopefully you get past it, and you get to the other side, and you see that actually things can be given meaning, and we all have that power, or we have the power to set our own goals and create something, or look for meaning in different ways. And this is the point, like, this is the ideal, or the sublimation, which saying that Carey and Kaufman have hinted at, that we can create something beautiful. And it doesn't, I've never seen anyone who has realized that everything is essentially meaningless, and then gone on to realize that everything can be as meaningful as you want it to be, and then said, let's go stab people. That's not really, that doesn't comply with my experience. I don't know if
I mean, that is exactly what psychopaths do. Like, I'm sorry, but that is exactly what psychopathy and sociopathy is. And I mean, I'm totally acknowledging that there's this other side of it that's beautiful and positive, but yeah, it's saying that nothing matters and I can create whatever meaning I want to. And so I'm going to lie and cheat and whatever. And, you know, I'm going to do me. And
some people do go that way when they have these realizations. But I think that a lot of the reason for that is because, okay, maybe these realizations are kind of we could see them as the shadow self, or part of the shadow self of our society. Like, we don't want to acknowledge that, oh, fuck, we're like on a rock floating through space and it's all kind of meaningless, and what the heck are we doing? So when people struggle with that, they're kind of alone. I don't think that having that point of view and that perspective that things are inherently meaningless, or that we need to create our own meaning, is the problem. I think that the problem is that when people are questioning that, they're alone, or there's something in them that makes them then go, okay, so the meaning that I want to create is destruction. Like, psychopaths are going through that, but the problem is that there's something base within them that says, I can do whatever I want, so I want to hurt people and destroy. And I don't think that that's where a healthy human being would be. And I think that most people, if they went through this, and especially if this is something that our society acknowledged, could go through it and could be guided or would go to a much more beautiful place with it. And I think maybe a lot of the problems of our society today are because of nihilism, but maybe it's because we're all in that existential crisis phase, you know?
I tend to think it's more like a phase. Like what you're saying, like, I don't think there's any argument you can make that's provable or self-evident that everything is meaningless and there's no higher meaning. And it's just a mustard assumption is saying that there's a Christian God who's looking down on us, and it just happens to be the trend of the time that's maybe not the trend of the time, but it's the stage of the dialectic that we're at. That's what people tend to believe right now.
That's the point. Like it's a personal experience. So it doesn't necessarily matter if it's the ultimate truth of things, but it is something that a lot of people go through.
It's not a personal experience. I would argue it's a historical experience. Like I would argue that
it might be a historical experience, but it's absolutely a personal experience.
I would argue that what you guys are describing is something very similar to like the Nietzschean perspective. You're basically saying like, God is dead, and so we're going to create our own meaning and a triumph of the will and all this stuff. You know, even though you guys are framing it differently and you're going through a Buddhist perspective, like ultimately it is kind of an Ubermensch perspective. And I guess what I'm kind of arguing for is more like a Jungian perspective, because Jung was like responding to Nietzsche, and he was saying like, actually there's all these pitfalls when you try to create your own personal morality, your own personal meaning. And if you're going to do that, what you really need to do is you actually do have to go back to the past and go back to meaning and go back to things that are ancient.
So I just want to break in and just say a couple of things. The first thing is, so clearly, as Kurt was saying, most people probably wouldn't, upon realizing that God is dead and nothing matters, most people probably would not go and just immediately start like killing people and causing havoc. But as Ariel said, yes, there absolutely are psychopaths, and there's a small percentage of the population that absolutely would do that. And the second thing that I wanted to say is that when you get to the other side of nihilism, as Katie or somebody was saying, and you decide to instead of taking the negative view on things, instead of saying, well, life is a blank canvas and I can make it whatever I want. And at that point, you have a choice. You can either do nothing, or you can do something terrible, or you can do something good. And most people would choose to do something good. Now, what that takes is it takes an act of faith. It takes an act of faith that you know what's good, and that what you're going to do is going to be that. And so it's not something that is objective. It's not something that can be proved to anybody. It's a conversation between you and yourself. Like, do you believe that what you are doing is good? And I'm sure that even psychopaths think that. I'm sure even people who are just totally evil, you ask them like, hey, why are you so evil? And they'd probably be like, I'm not evil. They'd probably be like, I'm just doing my thing.
One important point is I don't think psychopathy is a philosophical position. And I don't think you get to psychopathy because you go through pain and you question existence, and then you find meaning and just discover things. I think it comes from a very different place, maybe from childhood trauma or something like that. But I don't think it's really related to what we're talking about here.
I think to respond directly to what you're saying, Kurt, I think it's true in psychopathy, but in sociopathy, which is more like a socially constructed condition, it actually is the result of environment. Like sociopathy comes about when people grow up in environments that are like dog eat dog, every man for himself, everyone's lying, cheating, manipulating, whatever they want to. And I would argue that when you get rid of the rules, when you get rid of moral norms, you end up with a society where everybody is sociopathic.
Yeah, and I'm not.
Nobody here is arguing for removing moral norms. As I said, morality is intersubjective, so it's a negotiation, and we have to figure that out together.
And what I'm saying is that I'm using the label psychopath less as a technical term and more as a placeholder for those people who do evil stuff. Like what I'm saying is that to them, I don't think they're doing evil stuff. To them, I think they're doing whatever they think is best, right? And maybe you ask even 90% of people, and maybe they agree that that person is evil. But I guarantee you that person does not think that they are evil.
And so then you have to ask, like, is there a way that you can say, yes, they are evil? Or is it just, they're evil to me, but not to them, but sort of to that guy, and a 10 out of 4 out of 10 for that guy? Is it just completely subjective, or is there some realm in which you can say, yes, it's evil regardless of what anyone thinks?
Well, clearly the number of people who think that something evil matters. I mean, just as a matter of consequence, for one. But for two, I think that, you should try to piss off the minimum number of people as possible while making the greatest number of people possible happy. But clearly there's a lot of, different standards that people might have that roughly fit that definition.
But no, I mean, morality can't really be a popularity contest, right?
I think that this is tough. I want to respond to the question that you asked. Like, I don't think that morality can be a popularity contest. If you kind of go through this existential crisis and then through the other side, I think morality becomes a little bit tricky and an interesting conversation. Because Chris, you said something like, if you get to the other side and you say, I can create life how I want to, or better, like everyone is creating the world as we want to. There's other natural forces other than humans as well, obviously, of course, but that we can create what we want to. So let's create something good. Then you get to the question, of course, what is good? Is what I think is good actually good? Am I actually benefiting people? And that question of what is good is so huge, and you can debate about it for and muse about it for just as long from this kind of a post-nihilistic perspective as from a moralistic perspective. I don't think that just because you go through this, it doesn't mean you have to throw out all ideas of like what is good and what is evil. It's just a recognition that what is good and what is bad is, I like the word that Kurt is using, intersubjective, and that kind of we're creating it and we're discovering it together, and it might shift over time, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can't say is bad. It just means that the edges are a little bit fuzzy, and that's not fun to deal with. But I think it's kind of obviously true. Like, humans for all of history have not been able to agree on what is good, and maybe that's because there isn't a direct answer, and so maybe we need to accept that and then work from there.
That's what Carl Jung talks about. Like, I mean, to a certain extent, I would agree with what you guys are saying, but I would say that the intersubjectivity doesn't just include the people who happen to be alive. It includes everyone who's ever lived. And that's when you look at Carl Jung and what he talks about. Like, he looked at all human culture, basically, all human mythologies, like everything that he could get his hands on for decades and decades. And he found the underlying patterns. Like, you could have one tribe say you're supposed to sacrifice this way, another tribe you say you're supposed to sacrifice this way, and you could say like, well, clearly it's completely incompatible, and they have nothing in common because they have these different norms about sacrifice. But you can also look at a deeper level and look at the pattern that unites them. And once you do that, all these patterns start to emerge across cultures. Like, that's where you get into archetypes. And you could argue that what Jung was trying to do, he was trying to find something universal and deep within us. Something that wasn't just intersubjective, but that was at the very least biological.
This goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that basically that decision that you make once you get to the other side of nihilism, where you're like, okay, I'm going to start doing good things. It's an act of faith that those things that you think are good are good. That's the act of faith. Okay, you basically you basically just trust that you have a conscience, right? That'll tell you which things are good and which things are bad. And I think that there's good arguments to be made that there are biological causes for, there's a biological basis for our conscience.
That's not what Jung was saying, though. Like, what Jung was saying is that there's a rational process you can take. That basically, if you agree to the premise that morality is intersubjective, then there's a rational process you can take where you look at like all of mythology and you extrapolate out the patterns, and then you figure out what actually is meaningful, what is moral to human beings. Because the argument is your individual conscience can be messed up, so you can't just follow it blindly.
I think that would be an interesting place to go from a Jim Carrey type perspective, would be to go to, okay, all right, everything is meaningless. everything is meaningless, so I can create what I want. I want to create good. What is good? Then maybe look to Jung and and go through history and try to pull out these archetypes. But I also don't think that we can assume that the things that we've seen universally in humans are good either, because I think we also like universally see negative sides to humans, and we're trying to parse that out. And maybe like we want to move away from how things have been historically, because I think that most people would say that historically the world has been pretty unjust, and so maybe we do want to try something different and not just look to mythology and the way that humans found meaning in the past. I'm not saying discard it, but be skeptical of it also.
The meaning of the Garden of Eden is that human beings are not beings that always create good. The human being is a being that has the choice between good and evil. And when the modern person in like the post-God is dead world says, well, can we just cut out the evil part and maybe just have human beings be the being that always chooses good? And maybe we can create a society where things are just always good. And that's when you get utopianism. And that doesn't work either, as we've seen.
You're assuming that people who are going through this line of thinking would not also take that into account.
Well, what are
one thing that I want to?
I'm not trying to like assume anything or like attack. I'm just trying to like work through these things.
Yeah, and Ariel, I think one point of agreement, one point of agreement that I think most people would have with the line, or it's kind of a danger zone that you've highlighted, is that even people that are really deep into sort of a Buddhist mindfulness approach, or I think if you were to ask Jim Carrey if do you think it's preferable to take on multiple perspectives when crafting your version of meaning in the world versus just operating on your own beliefs? Most people in those camps would say, yeah, take a survey of multiple perspectives, because everybody engaged in this process has a pretty good firsthand understanding that the first person perspective is really limited. So I think when you're referencing Jung positively and saying, there's other systems that we can tap into to create the canvas, there's nothing in that statement that I would object to. That seems like, yeah, you definitely want to look at things from different points of view and then reference it as we're engaging in this creative environment. But was the core of your objection just that a single point of view is highly suspect failure point, or were there other components maybe that I didn't pick up on?
I think a big difference between the kind of Ubermensch perspective that I kind of perceive to be behind a lot of what Katie and Kurt are saying, and the more Jungian perspective that I'm in this moment arguing for, is it seems like with the Ubermensch perspective, the ultimate arbiter of meaning and morality, individual. Like, I'm going to create my moral system, and maybe I'll take a little bit from here, and I like some Buddhism, and I'm not so into this, versus the Jungian perspective, where it seems like you are humbling yourself to something greater, even if you call it, whether you call it human nature or whether you give it some spiritual name.
That's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense to me. Okay, so I can see it going in two ways. I wouldn't like calling my perspective an Ubermensch perspective, even if it might have a lot in common with it, kind of for that reason. I don't think that the perspective that I'm arguing for, or the perspective that Kurt is arguing for, or the perspective that Jim Carrey is taking is a perspective where I am the arbiter of morality. I think it's kind of the opposite. Maybe you do have to humble yourself to something greater. It's even humbling yourself to the idea that if you're searching for an objective truth, you're not going to find it. And like humbling yourself to the idea that we as humans may be meaningless to the universe, or that the universe is a great thing that doesn't have a set meaning either. It's a very you could take it as the most grandiose, self-centered perspective as possible, like that this has no meaning, I can do whatever I want, I'm the best, I decide what's moral, I'm not. Or you could take it as the most humble possible perspective of, I don't know anything, nobody knows anything, You could really, it's a very extreme perspective that's hard to nail down kind of by its nature.
So I just wanted to interject that I think one of the reasons why it's really useful to talk about Jung in this context is because Jung talks about the collective conscious, which is, this grouping of very old archetypes from, that have developed over millions of years and constitute something like, the moral rules of life. These rules seem to be built into every living thing. And so the older you go, the further you go back, the more solid of a morality you get, the more absolute of a morality you get. Ariel, you were saying that, the individual doesn't have a conscience that can really, sometimes your conscience might get it wrong. And I think that's true to a certain extent, but I think Jung would say, well, we have these deeper truths which are embedded in our biology. And those things actually are telling us things that are true. And then we have these more shallow layers of ourself, which are possibly deceiving us or telling us something, that we shouldn't follow, But yeah, the individual is the arbiter of stuff, I thought the point of this episode was going to be like, the individual it's not so clear cut what that even is. I mean, I think there are parts of us which are very universal, and there are parts of us which are very individual. And, maybe 99% of our awareness is actually, or of ourself is actually unconscious and is something that we can't access. So what I would say is that I think when you're connected to, and this is, I think, what religious people would say, when you're connected to that part of you that knows those ancient truths, then you can be sure that you're in connection with that part of you, and you can be sure that it's good. It's telling you something good. So
I agree with a lot of what you said, Chris. I think what Jung would say is, I made one criticism of like the kind of Ubermensch approach that Jung would bring up is he would say that like to become your most actualized self, you need to like make reference to the collective unconscious, and that's kind of the same as a system of archetypes that underlies all mythologies and religions. And that if you're like the conscious mind observing itself and observing its immediate environment in isolation, can easily become very pathological. And some of the dangers of this, like, kind of what I'm calling the Ubermensch perspective, which is maybe a bit specific because it seems like Jim Carrey and Katie and Kurt are necessarily arguing for, I think it's the same ultimate kind of thing, but I think Nietzsche had a different style. Create your own destiny, and it's this act of will, versus you guys are a little bit more like, we're painting a work of art and we're sitting back and observing and experiencing. It's a little bit more like it's a different style. Like it's a different style.
More of a co-creation than sort of an individual who does everything.
I don't know. I think that's a whole other thing. Maybe what were we going to get into, Katie?
That's a whole other thing. Well, I was going to kind of ask. We talked a lot about Jim Carrey and Andy Kaufman breaking all of these rules, and maybe that's amazing because it opens things up to this like post-nihilistic perspective, or maybe it's bad because it's it's breaking all these rules that are there for a reason. But I wanted to kind of bring that back to Jim and Andy and like what rules exactly were they breaking? Because I think we all have kind of a sense of it, but it's not entirely clear what rules they were breaking. I mean, like getting in fights and picking at people, yes, but like they were breaking rules on like a bigger level about like kind of breaking rules about the nature of the self. And I'm kind of curious, one, like if these archetypes are so universal, like do we see them fitting into Jim and Andy, or two, like if not, how were they breaking that, or how were they challenging that?
That's like another 2-hour discussion.
Specifically about the self.
Yeah, well, about the self, or about morality in general. Like clearly we saw what they were doing, and it inspired us to go on a conversation about, does morality even exist? Does anything even exist? So like what exactly were they doing that made us go this far?
Here's something I thought about. So watching the video about the happening on Fridays where they end up getting into a fight and everything, and Michael Richards comes and brings the cue cards and shoves them in Andy's face. I'm reading the comments on that video. A few people were saying stuff like, when this happened, I did not know what was going on. I didn't know if it was real or if it wasn't. And later thinking about it, I didn't know who was in on it. There's just no way to tell. So it's really playing with truth in an interesting way. And, you could say that's lying, I suppose. So, I mean, normally when there's a comedian, he has a certain license and he can say things that aren't true. And we accept that because it's not a lie, it's a joke, right? But then when you break this barrier and you don't know if it's a happening, and even some of the people involved don't know that it's a happening, there's a very blurry line, and that's kind of the rules that he's breaking there, the rules of truth.
So isn't okay, we're talking about archetypes. Isn't kind of breaking out of your society and like breaking these barriers in order to see the new, kind of the archetype of the hero's journey? Or like, is that maybe the hero's journey isn't the best archetype for that, but isn't what Jim and Andy were doing actually kind of an archetype in and of itself? Like I almost see Andy Kaufman as like a psychedelic trip for the American psyche. It was just like, whoa, what the fuck? and then we come back and we're integrating it with some new information. And like, I don't know if that's necessarily destructive, or if that could be, if you were looking through Jung's framework, maybe you could see that as like an archetype or part of the process.
Yeah, actually, I think that connects really well to what happens. And actually, I think you hit the nail on the head with, like, I see what Andy Kaufman did as a kind of hero's journey, but it's kind of like a collective hero's journey, right? So the idea of the hero's journey is the society has become old and disconnected from reality, and then the hero has this encounter with the unknown, where he struggles with the unknown, and then some, as a result of that process, some new knowledge about reality that wasn't being incorporated properly into the society beforehand. Now society knows the new rules, and they're able to incorporate that into their structure, and so the hero's journey is able to rejuvenate the society. And I think, I do see what both Andy Kaufman and Jim Carrey did as kind of this collective hero's journey, where we're all kind of embarking into the unknown together, instead of, just a hero draws his sword and goes off into the forest and kills a dragon, right? It's like everybody who's in on these happenings is almost like in this collective hero's journey.
Like they were, maybe we could talk about whether this is good or bad, but they were kind of dragging the audience into the unknown with them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it definitely was not up to the audience. But that doesn't.
It's up to the audience whether or not to watch. So that's part of it. Like it's up to you whether or not you want to follow what Jim Carrey or Andy Kaufman was doing. You didn't have to watch Saturday Night Live. You didn't have to watch Fridays. You didn't have to go to.
I mean, if you were physically present in the audience, like you're kind of like, okay, well, I'm here now, so I might as well make the best of this or something.
Right. Oh,
I guess like part of the hero's journey is like the idea the hero goes into the unknown, finds something of value, and brings it back for the society. And my question is, what were Jim and Andy bringing back to the society?
I think they're bringing back this perspective, this what we're calling the kind of post-nihilist perspective. Maybe you don't think that's a good thing, but I think that's
also known as the religious perspective.
Well, no, not the religious perspective. I'm talking about the perspective that like nothing is real, so let's create what we want. I think that's what they were going out and bringing back, because, well, I don't know if it's so big. Like, I don't think that Andy Kaufman and Jim Carrey were like, society is falling apart because religion is losing its hold and we need these new ideas. So I'm going to like embark on this exploration of identity and bring back this new knowledge. I don't think they were doing that, but I think they kind of are a part of that I see that happening, and I think that they're a part of that.
So I think part of it is that before Andy Kaufman, people had this very, very high reverence for television. And when you went on television, you had to have everything correct and you couldn't goof off or anything like that. So he broke that down. And I think it's really hard for us to say exactly how that affected cultural television. But yeah, that's part of it.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, and I mean,
Well, if we're saying that he's the grandfather of absurdist kind of reality TV, I feel like a lot of folks would put that in the negative column.
well,
I'd put it in the
It
positive.
It seems to me like Andy Kaufman was like Andy Kaufman and Jim Carrey both have a very like Nietzschean message, even though it's like, adapted to a different time and place and has a different style and incorporates Buddhist elements. But it seems to me like it's a very Nietzschean message. And like listening to you guys talk, like maybe I personally need to inhabit that more. And I know it's a useful thing to inhabit and to have experience inhabiting. But what I'm questioning isn't so much the value of what they did, but it's whether that's an endpoint or whether that's like a bridge onto something that comes after where meaning is restored.
That's a good question.
And I think Andy's definitely more Nietzschean than Jim, particularly in that. I'm not super well versed in Nietzsche's biography, but what I take away is that he kind of died miserable and alone and confused, and that kind of seems like what happened with Andy as well. Jim, at least, he's saying things like he's renouncing elements of his identity, and there's not really a Jim there, and we're all just kind of painting on this canvas. But he seems to be at least on the path of getting towards a product of some kind of like knowledge that he's exporting, kind of like Katie said, where he's trying to spread a message of like, yeah, we have a lot of social conditioning that's pretty crappy, and then we can actually make more beautiful things with less suffering and more joy if we co-create. And that term's been tossed around a lot in this conversation. So yeah, I mean, if we're looking at, I view, based on this conversation, Andy is more of the Nietzschean mess that might have had some interesting things to say that got people thinking, but was ultimately kind of self-destructive, and left a lot of people confused. And then Jim also grabbed a hold of that suffering for a while, and wrestled with it. And then, I think that the positive takeaway, like if there's a direction to this kind of conversation, it is, co-creation that seeks to reduce suffering and increase different kinds of expressive joy.
Well, and I think something really important that Jim says at the end, I guess, spoiler alert, is he was like, yeah, I think I'm kind of done with this Jim Carrey character. I feel like I really just want to do this with somebody else, like how many other people can I just become? And then he says something like, I think I'm just going to become Jesus Christ. And then the movie ends.
So, I mean, I think it is.
I do see it as kind of quasi-religious, like maybe you don't see it that way, but it does seem like, okay, well, I'm just gonna have this kind of blind faith that what I'm doing is good for the world, and I'm just gonna keep doing it and see where this goes.
I think it's a bridge. I mean, it is kind of religious or spiritual. And to Ariel's question, I think that it's a bridge, but I think that the thing about it is, a bridge to where is the interesting question, because I think that this particular perspective could bridge you really to a lot of different perspectives. It's bridging me to this co-creation. It might, this existential crises also bridge a lot of people to going back to more traditional moral frameworks. They say everything is meaningless, and so let's imbue it with this meaning. I see Jordan Peterson as kind of like that. Like, he talks a lot about God and Christian values and, these kinds of archetypes and the hero's journey and stuff like that. But I still haven't really heard him argue for the existence of God, but he does argue about why these values are good. It seems like it could even come from a similar kind of philosophy at a certain level. I think this philosophy could bridge you to a lot of different places, but it shouldn't be an endpoint. Like nothing matters. I don't think is a good endpoint.
I think it's also important to make a distinction between like traditional Christianity, that the type that like existed in, let's say, the 1600s, versus like the kind of perspective that Jordan Peterson and Carl Jung are putting forward, which is very different. Like, because it's gone through that transformation. Like what Jung is doing, what Jordan Peterson is doing, it's like a postmodern, post-nihilist, like it's post everything. It's not just like, okay, let's just try to forget about all that and erase our memory like an eternal sunshine of the spotless mind and try to go back to before the breakup. Like, it's not like that. It's like it's incorporating all the insights from all this process that's happened. It's post multicultural. It's looking at like a lot of like cultures and religions from around the world and like integrating and looking at patterns. So it's different than, it's not just going back. It's still going forward, just in a different way.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if the conflict, well, I don't know if we have so much of conflict, but I'm wondering if like the discussion that we were having is less about this kind of existential breakdown part, and the like nothing is meaningless, and so we create our own meaning, and more about what, like, where do we go from there, and what kind of meaning are we choosing to create. I know there's kind of like a hippy-dippy trippy co-creation kind of way that you could go, or there's kind of like a responsibility tradition, like there's multiple ways that you could go, really, that you could be considered good.
I mean, I think another difference in our perspective is you seem to be taking it as a given that everything is meaningless, and that whatever we choose based on that, it still doesn't affect that basic reality. And I'm not really taking it that way. The way I see it is like there's a historical phase and a personal phase where it's necessary to believe that everything is meaningless and to go through that existential crisis and to be postmodern and all that. You know, like, I know those things are a little bit distinct, but it's necessary to go through that phase. And then after that, I'm kind of agnostic to whether meaning comes back or not. Like, I do think that there might be a greater meaning to everything that we can discover. I mean, rather than just create.
I mean, to me, like, so to address what Katie said about Jordan Peterson, he never actually does argue for the existence of God, but he does argue for the necessity and meaningfulness of the Bible and religion. And the other thing that I wanted to say is, it seems to me that, you know, if anything is going to have meaning in life, it's that humanity and life have been doing something since the beginning, you know, for millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years or thousands of years, you know, and your parents and your grandparents and your ancestors were all doing these things, and they're all participating in this process of life, and you get to participate and help out, you know, and you maybe go on your own hero's journey and wrestle with the unknown, but then the point is you end up bringing something back to this kind of understructure of life and adding to it and improving it. And you're it's this ancient structure, and you're affecting it in a positive way. I think that's what gives stuff meaning.
Jordan Peterson actually does argue for the existence of God. He starts off by what you just said, that there's this whole long process that's gone back for millions and even billions of years. And these like archetypes that emerge from our biology, and then and they seem to like have patterns that relate to the patterns in matter and stuff like that. And his basic argument at a certain point, he's not really arguing for God, but he argues for agnosticism. Like, why do these archetypes exist? Why do these patterns exist? Why does Why does the material reality seem to be isomorphic to these realities that exist in the collective unconscious? And he's like, it could be some higher spiritual thing. We don't know. And it makes no sense. There's no justifying the assumption that it's all just meaningless.
Okay, so I want to step back there. When I say everything's meaningless, I'm meaning on a certain level. And I think I do take that as an assumption. While you guys were talking, I was kind of thinking about like, do I assume that, or am I agnostic on meaning? I think that you can create meaning. I think that you can imbue things with meaning. I think that some things are more naturally feel meaningful to us, especially the less that we think that we're putting the meaning into it and the more that we think that it's inherent. But even if I was going to say I'm agnostic about the existence of God, which on some level I am, like I'm pretty darn atheist, but yeah, I'm agnostic. But even if we're going to say that God exists and that God gives us all meaning, then I would just zoom out one more level and say, okay, well, great. So there's some being that's playing his own game. Why is that meaningful now? Like, I really do think that we have to imbue things with meaning. And even if there is a God that has a plan for us, I don't think that that's inherently meaningful. To me, that would seem kind of, that I personally wouldn't like that or consider that more meaningful. I would consider it less meaningful.
Well, I would
if I was
disagree.
serving somebody else.
I would disagree that there's necessarily a plan to where this life thing is going. I think it's as I kind of implied earlier, like it's a dialectic, it's a process, and everybody that contributes to it in a completely unexpected way. So it's not like, I mean, all right, okay, I guess, you know, there you can argue that there's some kind of grand plan to it all, and maybe there is, but that's not the way I see it, and I still see it as meaningful, even though there isn't some grand plan where everything is going to go.
No, I was saying that I don't believe that there's a grand plan. And I don't think that in order to believe in God or to believe in inherent meaning, you have to believe in a grand plan. But I think that a lot of people believe that meaning comes from God and meaning comes from there being a purpose. And I was saying that, okay, even if you believe that there is a God and he has a purpose, or she or it or whatever has a purpose, that isn't inherently meaningful. That just means that there's another level where someone else is creating their own reality and creating their own meaning outside of us. And
right.
Fine. But if we want to consider that meaningful, we still have to imbue meaning into that. It's just something that a lot of people feel inclined to imbue meaning into.
Well, what if it goes all the way back? Like, what if it's like we're characters in a story in another universe that's on another path that was created by a God who's in his own universe where things are happening and there's a purpose to it. And that whole universe is created by a being in a different universe. Mm-hmm. What if it just goes all the way back infinitely and every single one is meaningful?
Well,
it could. It could.
But what I was going to say is the every level has more meaning, right? So there's the you, and you're creating your meaning, and that's not very meaningful, right? But if you're combining with this long, rich history of millions and billions of years of life, and you're adding to it, that seems to be even more meaning. And then if we discover that there's that we're in a simulation or there's some plan and there's some being that's creating us and doing all these things, then that's an even higher level of meaning. And I think that you can, maybe there's no absolute meaning, but I think that on each level there's an increase or a decrease of meaning.
I disagree. I disagree with that. I think that on each level, you can zoom in and make the tiniest level infinitely meaningful or infinitely meaningless. And if you zoom out further, you can make it infinitely meaningful or infinitely meaningless. Like if it was going all the way back, God's creating universes with more gods creating more universes with their own purposes, then you could just say, okay, so then the God would be the individual who's creating its own thing and creating its own meaning. And we're just seeing that back and back and back in a loop. And it's like fractal patterns all the way down, like as above, so below, whatever. It would just be like parallels. And I don't see why, just because something was bigger, that it would be inherently more meaningful. That's a whole nother discussion, but I think it would still be, I think we still, no matter what the reality turns out to be and what we discover, we still choose how we want to interpret that in terms of meaning.
Well, I mean, I think for one thing, it's important to point out that when we're using the word God, we're being a little bit facetious, because I think we all acknowledge that it could be, a non-agentic. There could be a non-agentic meaning to the universe. It could be, I mean, the way I sometimes think about it is
agentic?
Agentic, yeah. Like God is an agent. So it could be that it's something that doesn't have agency. But it could have agency. Like agency seems to be significant in the universe. Or it could be a group of gods, which many cultures have believed, but we don't know. It could just be that there's some purpose to the universe, and there's no being that's thinking up the purpose. There just is a purpose. I guess the way I think about it is like, it still seems to me that it's a very different perspective to say, if you are thinking like the universe has a purpose and there's some purpose to all this happening, there's some pattern that's pointing towards something. It's a different way to look at things than to say there is no purpose and we're all just on our own. Like it seems that if there is a purpose, like your options do become more limited in a way, because then you're either working with the purpose or you're working against the purpose. And so on a certain level, you're either working with existence or working against existence. And that's when you get, you can call that good and evil. And if morality does exist, if there is an objective morality where you can choose to be good, you can also choose to be evil.
Cool.
I mean, that exists with or without the superstructures. So I don't know why we would engage with the superstructure conversations, because that just seems like more question begging. And at some point, each individual has a responsibility to decide how they're engaged in the act of co-creation and what kind of impact that they want to have.
What does question begging mean, Dan?
So you went on, okay, well, it's possible that the universe has, potential, agent-based creation structures or not. And then we could hypothesize that activities line up with that purpose or not. But it just begs the question, why would we go on asking about those things if there's, more simple, direct questions of like, okay, well, how do we want to behave with the stuff that we can actually observe? Like the existence or not of these additional, pre-Big Bang, architects. It's first of all, it's hard to say how any evaluation of those things would even be possible. And then second, what impact, like if this whole, if all of what we can perceive is just some simulation that is a computational mechanism to do some, transdimensional like software update, like who cares? I don't see why engaging in those conversations wouldn't, like, even if we could perceive any of that information in order to make any reasonable claims about what those things might be, why wouldn't we instead just work with what we can observe? And, to whatever degree we want to take into account historical narratives, we can do that. But imagining stuff that exists beyond the scope of the perceivable, it seems like it adds a lot of complexity that's unnecessary to some more direct questions that we could spend our time discussing.
Well, Daniel, when we operate in the world, we always go outside what we can directly perceive. We always have to extrapolate in our models of the world. It's just when those extrapolations are in line with what our society leads us to extrapolate, then we don't notice it as much.
Well, and there's a difference between things that we can perceive but don't perceive, and things that we can never perceive. And I think maybe Dan is talking about the second one.
I mean, we can't perceive the future, but we're always incorporating it into our models.
So,
but we can eventually perceive whatever it is, we were projecting out to.
Yeah, I think we're talking about the difference between like posing questions that are really like impossible to answer. But one thing, I'm not sure if you were kind of getting at this, Dan, but it made me think like kind of the way that I see meaning is meaning comes a lot from the stories that we create and the stories that we weave and how those stories make us feel. And I think that for most of us and for a lot of people, the grander of a story that we see ourselves as a part of, the more meaning that gives us. But also, if we're thinking about even quite literally with stories like literature, there's some really amazing authors, and it's the work of a great author to be able to take something very mundane and to weave a beautiful story with it. And I think that whether there is meaning in the universe or not, some people, when they're looking for a purpose, they're saying, like, how big does the story go? Like, if we can see the story being as big as possible and as grand as possible, and we're all part of a plan and there's a God, then that's what gives it meaning. Whereas other people take this perspective of like, okay, as big as it is or as small as it is, like what story can we make out of it? And I think that like a self-actualized person becomes a very good storyteller and meaning imbuer.
But again, Katie, like I'm not saying the most significant stories are stories that are as big as possible, but it's about the connectedness. Like great storytellers can tell great stories about really tiny, seemingly mundane events because they're not creating meaning. They're seeing the meaning in those events. They connect those small mundane events to archetypes and to these grander narratives and to what it means to be human and to these things that many people can relate to. And that's what makes a great storyteller, is because they're seeing they're seeing how the little story connects to the big story.
So literally everything is interconnected. I don't know, maybe we could argue against that, but everything is interconnected. And we can even if you zoom all the way in. Like if we're thinking about infinity, there's an infinite number of numbers between 1 and 2, and there's also an infinite number of numbers between 0 and 100,000, or between 0 and all the way out infinity. But like no matter how small or how big you get, there's infinity. And what I'm saying is, like, no matter what the story is or where you choose to focus, you could create infinite meaning or meaninglessness depending on how you go.
Well, some stories are meaningful to us and some aren't. Like if I could tell one story, like there was a mouse. The mouse went to the store. The mouse bought a piece of cheese, and then the cat stole the piece of cheese. Like that's one story. That's a mediocre story. But I could tell a different story that was like, there was one mouse, and then there was a second mouse, and then there was a third mouse, and then there was a fourth mouse. And that's like anti-meaning, right? So that's like, there's reasons that we find some things meaningful.
So yeah. So I think a lot of actually what gives meaning has been sort of pointed to in this conversation. And I think it has to do with things being fractal in nature, things being self-referential. When somebody tells a new story and then you realize that it's actually a very old story, that's when the meaning hits you, right? It's like when and actually in Gödel Escher Bach, he talks about this just ad nauseum. The whole book is about self-reference and stuff like this. But one of the examples he gives is he talks about Bach's music, right? So Bach produced all these fugues and things, and the cool thing about these fugues is that they have this this group of this melody, right? This little group of notes, and it gets repeated throughout the song, but it gets repeated in different ways. And sometimes it'll be, the right hand plays it and the left hand plays it. And sometimes it'll be, the right hand plays it really fast. And then the left hand plays it really slow. And it's the same pattern, but it's just, stretched out or compressed or something like that. And he'll do things like play them backwards or, put them upside down or something like that. Or have it a bunch of times at the beginning and then like one time at the end, And so I think a lot of that sense of meaningfulness that we get from life is when our brains connect something to something else that's very distant, right?
I think that's true, and then I think that we can also get a sense of meaningfulness when something comes so far out of left field that it makes us question everything that we knew. Like why is Andy Kaufman meaningful? Like why is what Jim Carrey did meaningful? Like even if we don't like it, even if we're kind of arguing about whether it was positive or negative, like clearly it's meaningful to us and doesn't just come off as like novelty.
Yeah. So if you want my opinion on why I think what they did was meaningful, I think a lot of it has to do with television was a new medium. When Andy Kaufman was around, a relatively new medium, and he did stuff that wouldn't have worked without television. So I think his success tells us something about the world that was new at the time. And I think maybe Jim Carrey does something similar with movies.
I think it can't just be novelty. Like my instinct, which again comes from my biases with these questions, but it's like the idea of the dialectic, like we're on this path and in history, and the way that we move through that path is we like keep shifting perspectives. Like we have a perspective and then we see what's wrong with it, and then we get a new perspective and it feels really good, and then there's that progression. And I think they were pointing to kind of the next stage, like the next insight that needs to happen, and then that feels like really scary and exciting, because it's not just novelty. If it was just novelty, then you wouldn't have to be Andy Kaufman. You could just be a random person yelling gibberish on a street corner would be just as exciting as Andy Kaufman. And that's clearly not what happens.
Right.
And Ariel's story about the first mouse and then the second mouse and then the third mouse would be like really meaningful.
About that story, it's really funny because Andy Kaufman actually once got up and sung 99 bottles of beer on the wall. All the way through.
I was going to say what's kind of funny about that is that story is exactly the story that Andy Kaufman would want to tell. He would say there was a mouse, and then there was another mouse, and then there was another mouse, and he would do that for like an hour, and that would be the act, maybe.
Yeah, I think it has a lot in common with like Dadaist art, you know, which is an outgrowth of the postmodern philosophical movement. You know, it's kind of like, well, why is anything true? Why is anything good art? Why is anything meaningful? Let's just make something that's as purposely non-meaningful as possible, so that people will have to question what is meaningful. I think that's largely what it is.
It's like there's yeah, I was just going to reiterate the point I've already made a couple of times, is basically like there's this meta level of what's the whole thing that's happening and what stage are we at. So it's possible that it's this whole long teleological meaningful thing that's taking place, and one stage of that place is to question the whole process itself, to question meaning, to believe and to experience meaninglessness for a period. But I will, we have been telling stories that are meaningful and have a narrative arc for tens of thousands of years. And I would lay money that in 1,000 years, we will be telling stories with narrative arcs. We will not be telling the one mouse, and then there was a second mouse, and then there was a third mouse, and there was a fourth mouse.
I think you're right. And I think maybe we just hit on something that Andy was doing that was so cool, was that he was highlighting, he was being so different in such a specific way that he was highlighting kind of what everything else has in common, that maybe we didn't realize that stories generally have a narrative arc in this way. And it took somebody doing something really out there and counter to that, not just saying it, but demonstrating it to throw people off. And then we have to talk about it a lot in order to figure out what it actually was. And then that gives us some more knowledge about what we've been doing all this time in the first place. I think it's a stage, and I think it's also something that maybe it's helpful to have like constant injections of. Like, I think that the world really benefits from having people that go completely off the wall in order to highlight what it is that we're all doing the same, that we're taking for granted.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, that's what a hero's journey is. It's like, you have all these rules, but really, why are we following these rules? Do we really need to follow all of them? Do we need to follow them to the letter? It's kind of like that. It's kind of like, what if we break them? What'll happen? Did anything bad happen? Okay, some stuff that was bad it happened. So, maybe we should keep that rule, or maybe we should, just tweak it a little bit.
Cool. Well, I think that brings us to a pretty good place in thinking about Andy Kaufman and Jim Carrey and their legacy and what they mean for the meaning of the universe. It's kind of a funny place. Does anybody have anything else that they really want to add to this conversation right now?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the show. Goodbye.